Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lesson 4, Building Blocks of Categorical Propositions. Before this point, you have been studying informal logic, whereby you looked at what it means when people make mistakes in everyday speech. Now we're going to look at more formally constructed arguments, and eventually we'll see what those mistakes look like. So welcome to formal logic. First, we're going to begin by talking about arguments, right? Because now we're moving into more formally constructed arguments. So building an argument is like constructing a building. Before you took this class, you were building a lot of arguments. Some of them good and some of them not so good because you did not have the tools to really understand how to build arguments well. If we follow that analogy and you were to start a career as in construction, there are some specific skills that you would need to ensure that when you put the building up, that it would stand. You would need to have a good foundation, that kind of a thing. The same thing is the case in building arguments. I know that you have heard arguments that for whatever reason you didn't agree with the arguments, maybe because you didn't like them, but you couldn't clearly identify what was wrong with the argument or what was right with the argument. And vice versa, you made arguments that you probably thought were good arguments and they probably were not. So in this section, we're going to work on giving you the tools to understand how good formal arguments are constructed. So arguments can be inductive or deductive. You remember this conversation from your reading in chapter 2. So another way of saying this is that arguments can use inductive or deductive reasoning. Do you remember what inductive reasoning is and what deductive reasoning is? If you don't, go back and review lesson 2, I believe it is. Yes, lesson 2 on basic logic. So arguments can use inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning. The logic that we are going to be working on for the next couple of weeks, it's using deductive reasoning, or we will be looking at deductive arguments. So what is an argument? An argument is a series of statements or propositions that presents reasons for accepting a conclusion. Again, an argument is a series of statements or propositions that presents reasons for accepting a conclusion. You are going to need to memorize a definition of argument. You can use this one, or you can use the one in the textbook. I want you to pay attention to two things in this definition of arguments. The first is that statements and propositions mean the same thing. They can be used interchangeably. Statements are propositions and propositions are statements. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to here, and it will be reinforced later, is that arguments are statements, are series of statements, and they give you reasons for accepting a conclusion. So one statement by itself is not an argument. So what is a statement? A statement is a sentence that's capable of being true or false. A statement is a sentence that is capable of being true or false. And so arguments are made up of statements. Not all utterances are statements, right? Because remember this, in order for the sentence to qualify as a statement, it must be able to be true or false. So there are some sentences that are not statements, and they include questions, proposals, suggestions, commands, exclamations, etc. You could go on and on. Examples of those include, where is cartoon? That's a question. Let's go to the movie. That's a proposal. I suggest you get contact lenses. That's a suggestion. Turn off the TV right now. That's a command. Fantastic. That's an exclamation. So none of those utterances that we saw before would qualify as statements. Therefore, they would not make up arguments. So let's go back again. So arguments are made up of statements. At least one of the statement has to be a premise, and the other statement is a conclusion, at least one. You can have more than one premises. So arguments are made up of statements. Hopefully you understand that. At least one is functioning as a premise. There could be more than one. And one, exactly one, is functioning as a conclusion. So let's define premise. The statement, at least one of the statement is functioning as a premise. So what is a premise? A premise is a statement that gives you a reason for accepting the conclusion. Said differently, a premise is a statement that's giving you the evidence for accepting the conclusion. So let's look at this argument. We saw this argument before in lesson 2. Monkeys like banana. You can also read that statement as all monkeys like bananas. Lucy is a monkey. Therefore, Lucy likes bananas. So I want you to use this argument to refresh your brain on all that was taught before. So statements have to be able to be true or false. So are all of these sentences statements? Let's look at them. Monkeys like bananas. Is that a sentence that is capable of being true or false? If you said yes, you're right. Same with Lucy is a monkey. Is that capable of being true or false? Yeah, because Lucy could be a giraffe. So in this case, Lucy is a monkey. And then look at the conclusion. Lucy, therefore Lucy likes bananas. That is also a statement because it is capable of being true or false. The other thing that I want you to use this example to refresh is that two of these statements are functioning as premises. Why? Because they are giving you the reasons for accepting that Lucy likes bananas. And the conclusion that you should accept if you follow the logic of the premises is that Lucy likes bananas. I hope that this is as clear as it can be. So at this point, I want you to put logic in practice in your other classes. Even though you don't have all the tools yet, I want you to, when you are writing argumentative papers, that you think about premises that lead to conclusion, that you think about, are my premises leading to this conclusion? So you could put that in practice right away, okay? So the conclusion, as we saw with the example of Lucy, is the statement that the evidence is claimed to support or imply. The conclusion is the statement that the evidence is claimed to support or imply. In this definition, we're saying claimed because in a bad argument, the statements don't actually imply the conclusion, but they are claiming to. So what is the definition of the conclusion? The conclusion is a statement that the evidence or premises is claimed to support or imply. Now, arguments can fall into two groups. The two groups are good arguments and bad arguments. So let's start with the first group. Those in which the premises support the conclusion. If the premises actually support the conclusion and give you good evidence for accepting the conclusion, that's a good argument. And those in which the premises do not support the conclusion, even though they claim to. So the premises do not support the conclusion, even though it's claiming to. That is a bad argument, otherwise known as a fallacy. All right, perfect. So let's look at an example of an argument. The argument is all film stars are celebrities. Halle Berry is a film star. Therefore, Halle Berry is a celebrity. So hopefully all the information that you got before, you're able to see why this is an argument. You're able to see that the first two propositions or statements are the premises, and the last proposition or statement is the conclusion. At this point, I want to introduce something new to you that you will need to implement from here on out. This is your introduction to using symbols in logic. So the first symbol that you are going to learn is the symbol for therefore. You notice that that symbol is the 3 dots. I tried to make it easy for you to incorporate symbols into your homework by putting a document that has a Word document that has all the symbols there. All you need to do is copy and paste those symbols into your homework assignments. So Halle Berry is a celebrity is the conclusion that you should accept. So now that you've seen arguments, you've seen at least 2 arguments, one about Lucy and the other one about Halle Berry. You need to understand that not all passages are arguments, because whenever you're reading a passage, it doesn't only have statements in it. You can have questions or suggestions or commands or proposal. Not all passages are arguments. But even if they're all propositions, it might not be an argument. So let's dive into that. It is important to be able to distinguish passages that are arguments from passages that are not. And in fact, that's what you will need to do for your homework this week. So arguments must have the following. So look for the following. At least one premise. You know what a premise is. And the premises are either making claims. The premises are making claims, right? Remember, the claim is the evidence that you're supposed to accept in order to get to that conclusion. So that's the claim. So the claim that the premises are making, you want to look for these things. You want to look for a premise, and then you want to look for the claim that the premises is making. The claim, in other words, is something that follows from the evidence or reasons. A claim can be either explicit or implicit. So what is an explicit claim? How do you know that you're seeing an explicit claim? And because you see an explicit claim, you know that this is an argument. Well, look for an indicator word. So an explicit claim is usually asserted by a premise or conclusion indicator word, such as therefore. Remember, thus, since, because. If you see therefore, you know that there's a conclusion. And if you see one other statement, it's the premise. And so you know that you're dealing with an argument. Not all arguments or not all passages are going to have indicator words. But the fact that there are no indicator words, that doesn't mean that it's not an argument. There might be an implicit claim. So an implicit claim exists if there are no indicator words, but there is an inferential relationship between the sentences. The sentences are connected, but there are no indicator words. So let's look at an example of an implicit claim. The genetic modification of food is risky business. Genetic engineering can introduce unintended changes into the DNA of the food producing organism, and these changes can be toxic to the consumer. That's an argument, even though there are no indicator words. Why? There is an implicit relationship between the passages. The statements are connected, and you could see that the statements want you to accept a conclusion. It's an argument. So to identify an argument, keep an eye out for premise or conclusion indicator words, for the presence of an inferential relationship if there are no indicator words. And remember, a word of caution, that even though there is an indicator word, it does not mean that that is an argument. You want to look for all of the things that we talked about before. And so let's look at an example of something that looks like an argument, but it is not, because it has an indicator word. Let's look at this. Since Edison invented the phonograph, there have been many technological inventions. You see the since, remember we talked about what the indicator words could be, and you see since there, but that doesn't mean that this is an argument, because in fact, this is one sentence. This is one statement. So since is used not as an indicator word of a premise, it's just used to describe time. So it's not an argument. Let's look at an example where it is an argument and a similar construction. So since Edison invented the phonograph, he deserves credit for major technological innovations. What's happening here? The conclusion is that he deserves credit for the technological innovations. And then since is functioning as an premise indicator. And so that is an argument. We are going to move on to talking about logical propositions. Remember, we talked about arguments, right? And arguments are made up of propositions or statements. Remember, we can use those two words interchangeably, but now we're going to look to see how these propositions function so that we can actually use them. So there are three kinds of propositions that can be used in arguments. These propositions are hypothetical propositions. Hypothetical propositions are this is that statement. Hypothetical, this is that statement. Disjunctive proposition, which is either this or that statement. Categorical propositions, which we have already seen examples of, are this is that statement. So remember, Lucy is a monkey. Good. So hypothetical propositions, if this, then that. Disjunctive propositions, either this or that. Categorical propositions, this is that. And we're going to start off learning about categorical propositions first. So what are categorical propositions? We are going to learn more about categorical propositions by examining a type of argument. So the type of argument that we're going to learn to build for the next few weeks are called syllogisms. So syllogisms are made up of two premises and one conclusion. An example is what we saw before with Halle Berry and Lucy. Two propositions that create premises and one conclusion. So question, are syllogisms inductive or deductive? They are. Are syllogisms inductive? No, they're not. They are deductive. I'm sorry. So one example of a syllogism with categorical propositions we talked about before in lesson 1. The Father begot the Son. All that is begotten had a beginning. Therefore, there was a time when the Son was not. Bad argument, but an example of a categorical argument. So in this argument, you see that the propositions are called premises. And so now we're at the end of this lecture, but in lesson 5, we're going to learn more about categorical propositions and how they are used in syllogisms. Have a wonderful week.